is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin is heard for the first time since halting the rebellion, which he says started because of injustice, and claims his troops did not march to overthrow Russia's leadership.
That rebellion hits the ruble. The turmoil in Russia sends its currency plunging to a 15-month low.
Some drivers caught up in the Dieselgate scandal can now claim for damages from Volkswagen, Mercedes and Audi after a German court overturns a previous ruling.
Taking care of business. New Zealand and China talk trade and tourism during the Prime Minister's first trip to Beijing.
And dog of war. Rambo, the German shepherd, was badly injured on Ukraine's front line, but is now fighting fit and at the top of his game.
Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin says his march towards Moscow was not intended to overthrow the Russian government. Instead, it was a protest against the military commanders he holds responsible for failures in Ukraine. It's the first public comments from Prigozhin since Saturday.
The head of the mercenary group said his so-called March for Justice was started to avoid the destruction of his company. He said that would have been inevitable under the Ministry of Defence order that wanted to bring Wagner under its control by July the 1st. Prigozhin says his troops, who were asked to sign contracts with Moscow, have refused. Let's talk now to our correspondent, Mark Webster in Brussels. So we've been hearing, Mark, from Prigozhin as these dramatic events continue and some strong reaction coming out of Europe. What's been said?
Well, Prigozhin's remarks were by any standards enigmatic. He said that his march, as he called it, sending his soldiers, he claims, within 200 kilometers of the Russian capital, had exposed some serious lapses in Russia's internal security. Well, given that he also claims there was absolutely no opposition as they drove the long, long haul from Rostov-on-Don, that might be considered an understatement. But he then goes on to say, as you say, that this was not intended to remove the leadership in Moscow, despite the fact that he's been vitriolic in his criticism of the Russian defense minister and of the Russian head of the armed forces. Now, that alone he doesn't address. He says instead, as you said, he was trying to protect his Wagner group. Now, that faces compulsory integration into the Russian army on July the 1st. But analysts say, well, that doesn't really hold water, because now that he's gone, they've either got to just give in the fight completely, or they're going to be integrated into the Russian army. If they'll accept lower rates of pay, less good food and less good provisions. So we'll see how many of them do actually sign up. But it's been a busy day away from that, with analysts also saying that the rhetoric from European leaders about the position, particularly of President Putin himself, has become far more critical. Now, it started in the United States with the Secretary of State saying he saw cracks in the political leadership in Moscow. It was followed by the Italian foreign minister, who said that the myth of Russian unity was dead. And today, two senior European leaders have made their mark as well. Now, the first one was the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. He was on a visit to Lithuania, which of course shares a border with Russia. Alongside him was the Russian defense minister, who's promised 4,000 more soldiers to bolster Lithuania's defense. But Mr. Stoltenberg prefaced his remarks by saying, look, he understood that what happened at the weekend was an internal Russian affair. Nonetheless, he said yet again that the door was open to Ukraine to join NATO once the fighting was finished. He said that Ukraine will become a NATO member. Now, that, of course, is a red rag to a Russian bull. But it also, he added, clearly aware of the fact that provoking a nuclear power with more than 4,000 missiles is a dangerous game. He said that he thought Russia had been deeply irresponsible in terms of its nuclear policy, particularly claiming to have shifted some nuclear weapons to Belarus, which also has a border with Ukraine. In fact, this is what he had to say.
We condemn Russia's announcement about deploying nuclear weapons. This is reckless and irresponsible. If Russia thinks it can intimidate us from supporting Ukraine, it will fail. We stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Well, that was followed up by even stronger language from the EU person who's in charge of foreign affairs, Josep Borrell. Before the meeting of the 27 foreign affairs ministers in Luxembourg today, he said that what had happened in had happened in Russia over the weekend showed real weaknesses in the Russian leadership. He said that there were cracks appearing and that he was also worried about the stability of a power which is right on the doorstep of so many European countries. This was his contribution to the debate.
The most important conclusion is that the war against Ukraine launched by Putin and the monster that Putin created with the Wagner, the monster is biting him now. The monster is acting against his creator. The political system is showing the fragilities and the military power is cracking.
So, Mark, European leaders talking about standing strong with Ukraine, which is making advances in Bakhmut.
Absolutely, Paul, and I think that's behind a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing from Europe. Not only do they sense, perhaps, there has been a fundamental change in terms of the Russian leadership's security after the bizarre events of the weekend, but they're also looking at progress on the battlefield by Ukraine. Now, what the Ukrainian soldiers are doing, so Kiev says at the moment, is that they are testing that front line, a long front line against Russian soldiers, and they're trying to find weaknesses so they can deploy what they say is their main force. Now, that main force, of course, is equipped with Western weapons, tanks, artillery, the latest ammunition, the latest drones. All of that material, they say they would then throw in. But it's worth bearing in mind, again, military analysts are saying this is no easy way forward. It's no pushover. The Russians have had time to dig in, particularly in Bakhmut. The irony of which, of course, is this was the city that the Wagner boss, Prigozhin, said was the great triumph of Russia when they claimed to have taken it. And so, although it's meant to be fairly worthless as a military objective, it would be of enormous consequence for Kiev if they're able to retake it. It would show that there's real momentum in that counter-offensive, something which obviously give good heart to Ukrainian forces and would definitely increase the Europeans' confidence that they can, with European help, with Western help, they can win this battle.
Many thanks for that, Mark. Mark Webster in Brussels. And we'll be live in Moscow later in the programme with an update from the Russian capital. Robin.
So what are European investors making of events in Russia? Well, as the markets began to open on Monday morning, shares largely dropped, with defence, aerospace and financial stocks dragging those indices down. Some talk that events in Russia are adding to the uncertainty surrounding the prospects for the global economy. Well, it's been a pretty volatile day, but looking at the markets at the close, the France CAC 40, I can't show you that one, but that closed the day higher, with the FTSE 100 and the DAX in Germany both ending the day in the red. Let's talk now to Joshua Mahoney, who's Chief Market Analyst at Scope Markets. Good to talk to you, Joshua. So, plenty of uncertainty around at the weekend, and markets really hate uncertainty, don't they? How have European shares reacted to this?
Yeah, I mean, the key point that you're making here is that it was uncertainty over the course of the weekend. So we didn't necessarily see a big move in terms of volatility on this news in the first place that is now unwinding. Instead, we've seen it all play out. It began and it ended seemingly over the course of the weekend. In terms of the moves that we're seeing for some of these defense stocks, you know, the weakness for some of these stocks, I don't think it's necessarily justified. Ultimately, many of them cannot sell to Russia anyway. So what's happening internally is unlikely to hinder the expansion of this war with Ukraine. I think that's likely to continue. So I think those stocks are generally going to do relatively well. But the question mark around about how markets are feeling and the perception of risk within markets is that at the moment they seem relatively calm. We haven't necessarily seen major drops. And in actual fact, if you see the weakness over in the US indices, a lot of that is focused around tech stocks, the NASDAQ leading the declines. And within Europe, as you said, the CAC actually moving higher, the FTSE 100 moderately moderately lower, but for the time being, everyone's trying to understand exactly what's happening here and whether we are going to see it flare up once again. But it seems like we've got some sort of calm resolution as things stand.
There were some sectors, though, where we saw a bit of a sell-off. Defence, for one, aerospace, some financial stocks. Were there any winners today, though?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, look, I would say, like I said, a lot of the areas that have been weak have been mainly around, say, the tech sector over in the US. In terms of Europe, more domestically focused stocks doing relatively well. But yeah, I don't necessarily say that this is a day of major volatility per se. Maybe some initial movements that we've seen unwinding a little bit. But really, markets appear to be relatively sanguine as they wait for potentially market-moving events, which this, of course, would have seemed like over the course of the weekend. But the way we stand at the moment, it's quite difficult for people to really ascertain exactly what the state of play is and how to sort of position themselves off of the events in Russia.
And we are, of course, really in the middle of a bigger period of geopolitical uncertainty, which this is part of. Reuters reporting that Deutsche Bank says it can't guarantee its clients access to Russian stocks they hold. This really is quite a difficult time for investors, isn't it?
Yes, but what I would say is, you know, certainly from the perspective of someone in London like myself, if you're going to be investing in Russian stocks as someone within mainland Europe or within the US, they're probably going to perceive those kind of investments as a high-risk strategy, on the expectation that maybe down the line we get some sort of resolution and then that's going to benefit them over the longer term. But certainly for now, you know, if someone's complaining at the fact that their stocks in the Russian markets aren't necessarily liquid, you would probably like to say, well, this has been going on for some time, and arguably you could say that Russia always seems to be under one level of sanctions or another. You know, that's arguably one of the more risky areas to be playing in the markets.
Joshua, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Joshua Mahoney, Chief Market Analyst at Scope Markets.
So that's the picture in Europe, and of course global markets have been reacting to the weekend's events in Russia. Let's talk now to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. Hello there, John. We just heard Josh there talking about the impact on US tech stocks. Good morning, and how are the markets doing there?
Yeah, well, Robin and Paul, I have the same message as Joshua Mahoney there, almost the same message coming out of Wall Street as of the City of London. And the key thing is that, thank goodness, this happened on a Friday night. You know, if this had happened midweek, I think we would have seen big fall-offs in the markets and the bond markets as well. But it didn't. It happened on Friday. So we've all been transfixed Friday through Saturday through Sunday. And as Joshua was saying there, the whole situation appears now, at least on the face of it, to have been resolved, although it's very true that we're all still piecing things together. And there's an awful lot that Wall Street does not understand. I mean, one thing that is clear, for whatever reason it was, the Wagner what would you call it, a mutiny, I suppose, did fail over the course of the weekend. We've heard now from the leader of the Wagner Group saying that he turned back from Moscow to avoid bloodshed, and because what he was doing was really just a protest against some of the Russian military leaders. We have also on Wall Street seen pictures of President Putin, but there's no date stamp on the pictures that we're seeing here, so we don't know whether the pictures are fresh or not. And so from Wall Street's perspective, it's really been about two things: the ruble, the Russian currency, and also the oil market. So let's deal with the ruble first of all. It fell to a 15-month low earlier today in trading before we got underway here on Wall Street. That 15-month low goes back to the time of the beginning of the special operation in Ukraine. It has since rebounded, but we're getting reports here as well that Russians are trying to convert their rubles into dollars in greater numbers than they might otherwise do on an ordinary basis. And as for the oil market, well, Brent, which is the European benchmark, jumped by 1.3% earlier today, and WTI, which is West Texas Intermediate, that's also up now almost 1%, and that's based on contagion fears, which still exist as far as Wall Street is concerned, because we haven't completely resolved this. We don't exactly know where it's going. The main beneficiary, Robin and Paul, as always, and this is always the case when there is an international crisis along this lines, is gold. Gold benefited, of course, because that's seen as the safe haven. That's where the money goes at times of trouble, and gold is up about 0.6%. As for the main markets, well, it's pretty flat. I've got to be honest with you. I think we might have expected more of a sell-off that we did not get. The Dow is up 17 points, which is nothing really. The Nasdaq is being hit. The technology stocks are suffering, and the S&P 500 is down by only 2 points. The Nasdaq's down 1/3 of 1%. And I have to tell you that the reason the Nasdaq's down is that really the focus here, especially now that this situation appears to be calming down in Russia, the focus on Wall Street is, as it so often is, all about the Federal Reserve. And until we stop following every syllable that comes out of the mouths of people associated with the Federal Reserve, particularly the chairman, then this situation won't change in America. You know, we're all about inflation, recession, and interest rates. That's what Wall Street's mostly concerned about, even more than this potential global situation.
And so looking at other news today, John, I understand that President Biden is investing in the web. What's all that about?
Well, this is the internet, of course, and he's putting aside $42 billion. He'll make this announcement later today, Monday. $42 billion to try and bring the World Wide Web in terms of broadband to all 50 states. The money will be divvied up and sent out to all 50 states. He wants to bring all access broadband to the country by 2030, which is still about 7 years away. And this is all part of something we've talked about on the programme before, his kitchen economics, as he now is campaigning for re-election in November 2024. What they're doing, the early part of the campaign, is reminding everybody of all the things that they've passed in the first 2 years in office that has affected people, the things that they talk about around the kitchen table. You see, that's the idea. So that's what we're going to be doing later today. We'll be reporting on him. It's being likened to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who in 1936, 87 years ago, did pretty much the same thing regarding bringing electricity to all 50 states. The White House says there are 8.5 million locations that lack broadband in the country at the moment. And this is a startling statistic. I love this statistic. According to a survey done in 2019, so it's getting on for 4 years ago now, there are still 265,000 people in the country who use dial-up. Now, I haven't used dial-up in 25 years, and I'm sure you haven't either, but this just speaks to the vastness of America and some people who live in extremely rural areas where they're unable to get or afford, certainly, broadband internet, even from satellite providers. One last note of interest, Biden will talk about Bidenomics, which is the wider economic plan he has for re-election, in Chicago on Wednesday. That'll be the next time, apart from today, that we hear from him talking about economic issues. Paul and Robin?
John Terrett, thank you. I can certainly remember that awful noise that the dial-up used to make, so don't miss that. Thank you very much.
The acting boss of PricewaterhouseCoopers in Australia has apologised over leaked government tax plans. Kristen Stubbins told a parliamentary inquiry that a former partner had shared the confidential policy information between 2014 and 2017. She said other staff found to have been involved would be punished. On Sunday, the firm said it would sell its government consultancy business for just $1 Australian, equivalent to 67 US cents.
German business confidence worsened for the second straight month in June. The latest report from the IFO Institute showed the index plunged to 88.5, much worse than expected. The data suggests Europe's largest economy is heading for a longer recession than previously thought.
Luxury car maker Aston Martin has agreed a deal to make high-end luxury electric vehicles with a US company. $232 million deal with carmaker Lucid will include payments to the American company for its EV technology. Last month, Geely, one of China's largest independent car makers, doubled its stake in Aston Martin to 17%.
Well, a German court has lowered the bar for car owners to claim compensation in the Dieselgate scandal. Our correspondent Natalie Carney explains from Munich.
Plaintiffs can now recover part of the purchase price of their car if an illegal device was installed in the engine to help them cheat on emissions tests. With this judgment that came out on Monday, the Federal Court of Justice here in Germany has overwritten a previous ruling which essentially sided with the manufacturers. Before, only those who had been deceived by the car manufacturer about the pollutant emissions in an immoral way were entitled to claims. However, in March, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg set the criteria for compensation significantly lower in a Mercedes-Benz case from here in Germany, ruling that claims for damages could arise in a case of simple negligence and not only when they were deliberately being cheated or tricked. This latest ruling sees the German Federal Court of Justice fall in line with that ECJ ruling, recognizing these deceitful devices in diesel engines as illegal, paving the way for potentially millions of dollars in compensation claims. More than 100,000 proceedings are still open here in Germany, but a recent study by the International Council on Clean Transportation assesses that there are some 13 million diesel cars producing extreme levels of air pollutants still on the roads across Europe and the UK. Natalie Carney for CGTN in Munich.
You're watching CGTN, still to come. Kyriakos Mitsotakis' election gamble pays off with a second term and a strong majority. We'll be in Athens, where he's been sworn in again as Prime Minister.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back. New Zealand Prime Minister Chris Hipkins is in China for the World Economic Forum. He's on a 5-day official visit to the country and is expected to meet with the Chinese leadership.
That's right, both sides are looking to boost trade, expand cooperation on energy and climate change, as well as increase cultural exchanges. Chris Hipkins is the first New Zealand Prime Minister to visit China since 2019. His trip comes after the country's marked the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations last year.
Hipkins is leading one of the largest delegations the country has ever sent on an overseas mission. In an address at the New Zealand Embassy in Beijing, he expressed his willingness to boost trade between the countries.
New Zealand's open for business, and that we value our relationship with China, with everybody in it, with other businesses in it, and that we see huge potential to continue to grow and strengthen and widen and deepen that relationship. And our presence here today and the fact that we have such a strong delegation here today, I think is a real sign of our commitment and our willingness to put in the work to make all of that happen.
I've been speaking to Alistair Crozier, a former senior diplomat from New Zealand and now Executive Director of New Zealand China Council. He explained why Hipkins' visit is so important for New Zealand to recover its economy.
Yes, trade will undoubtedly be a very strong feature of the visit. And when you look at the calibre of our senior team that is travelling with the Prime Minister, you know, that's obviously a priority. We're very lucky that we've had a free trade agreement in place with China since 2008, and there was an upgrade to that agreement last year in 2022 to ensure that it remains current and relevant across new emerging areas like e-commerce, for example. But I think one of the strengths of this visit will be to focus not just on the traditional areas where we've had strong cooperation. Obviously, we're a very strong exporter of primary produce to China, and that's going to continue. But we want to kickstart again our education and our tourism engagement because during the COVID years, there just wasn't the flow of people between the two countries that we're accustomed to. And we have on the delegation representatives from emerging sectors as well, and I think that's a very strong area that we would like to advance during the visit. Areas like health and well-being, gaming, even companies working in the Chinese metaverse. And that's not something that perhaps China thinks of when they think of New Zealand, but we want to show that we have that breadth of value and experience across multiple sectors.
Because China is, of course, New Zealand's biggest trading partner, and perhaps it has slightly struggled to diversify its trade relationship with Beijing. Do you think that's changing now?
Well, I think there's definitely an intention to diversify. It's hard to go past those hero sectors that have been responsible for so much of our trade in the past. You know, our dairy and our meat, primarily, also our fruit and seafood and so on. That's not going to change rapidly because the demand for New Zealand products in those categories in China is just so large. But I think there is certainly an intention to focus back on some areas that were beginning to really perform for New Zealand prior to the COVID-19 years. Tourism, for example, we previously, up to about 2019, were welcoming 400,000 Chinese tourists a year to New Zealand. That effectively dropped to zero very, very rapidly. We want to see that come back, so we need to see a resumption of direct flights, and we're very pleased to see that those are already starting again very quickly. And education is definitely a part of that, with students returning to New Zealand as well.
Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis has been unveiling his new cabinet after his New Democracy Party secured a resounding win in Sunday's election. He'd called a second poll to secure an outright majority, and that's what he got, finishing more than 20 points ahead of the main opposition Syriza Party. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas in Athens. So, Evangelo, a government formed with some cabinet announcements already.
That's true. The new spokesperson for the Greek government now, Pavlos Marinakis, announced the new ministerial cabinet under the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis earlier today. We've seen a lot of reshuffling from the ministers. The Nikos Zendias, the foreign minister, is now the Minister of Defense. Giorgos Gerapetritis, the person who took over the infrastructure ministry after the deadly train crash in Tebi, is now the foreign minister. And the vice president of the New Democracy Party, Kostas Hatzidakis, is now the Minister of Finance. Though this process usually takes about 3 to 6 days, the Greek Prime Minister was eager to do it as fast as he can and get down to business as quick as possible. We were in his headquarters yesterday to his speech. He said specifically, it's time to roll up our sleeves and get back to business. Let's have a listen.
Accompanied by his wife and children, New Democracy leader Kyriakos Mitsotakis met Greece's President Katerina Sakellaropoulou to be sworn in and will now begin forming a government. While it usually takes few days for all the protocols to be completed, the new Greek Prime Minister is eager to get it done as soon as possible, something he mentioned overnight after his emphatic win.
The responsibility I have on my shoulders is very heavy, but tonight is a night of happiness and celebration. From Monday we have to roll up our sleeves and continue the hard work.
And that hard work seems to have paid off, as Greeks were convinced enough to trust him with their vote and elect Mitsotakis for a second 4-year term. The Conservative Party secured a total of 158 seats, allowing it to form a majority government, with the main opposition, the left-wing Syriza Party, led by Alexis Tsipras, far behind with 48 seats. This second round of elections came in the wake of the shipwreck where 82 people lost their lives and hundreds still missing at sea. But voters seemed more focused on the Prime Minister's past record.
Mitsotakis has promised changes and new policies. His plan is very precise and describes exactly what he will do and how he will do it. He's increased wages in the public and private sectors. He's created a stronger nation. Now he's pledging to update the healthcare system. We'll have to wait and see.
It is the first time since 1974 that there has been such a big difference between the first two parties. And while both leaders push for reforms such as rebuilding Greece's credit rate after the debt-long financial crisis, boosting the tourism industry, creating more jobs and increasing minimum wages, Greeks seem to punish opposition Syriza party, which collected less votes than the first round. As temperatures rise in the country, so too is the political temperature. With more than 8 parties in parliament coming from very different political spectrums, many are suggesting that Mitsotakis' job will be even more difficult this time.
So Prime Minister Mitsotakis seemingly keen to get started, but what are the main priorities for his government?
Well, the 55-year-old new prime minister is trying to focus on rebuilding Greece's credit rating, especially after the debt-long financial crisis. He wants to boost the vital industry of tourism to create more jobs, but also increase the minimum wages. Now, in his first term, the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis focused a lot of lowering taxes, bringing down unemployment, but also attracting more foreign investment. Now he also is focusing on the healthcare system, and what he says has been outdated and needs to be updated, similar to those of any other European nations. He also wants to update the infrastructure nationwide, especially after the deadly crash in Tebi last February. Now, of course, we're only a few hours within the new government, so there's a lot more to come. He has a lot on his plate, a very long agenda. Tomorrow, the new ministers will be sworn in at sometime 1 o'clock local time, and the Greek parliament will resume on July the 3rd.
Evangelo, thank you very much. Our correspondent Evangelo sits us in Athens.
And you can get the highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
Coming up on Global Business Europe, we'll be in Moscow with an update from the Russian capital after a weekend of turmoil.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail. The background.
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and Paul Barber. A reminder of our top story. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin is heard for the first time since halting the rebellion, which he says started because of injustice, and he claims his troops did not march to overthrow Russia's leadership.
Well, those are part of Prigozhin's first public comments since Saturday. Let's talk to our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. So, Dasha, a significant weekend. We have now heard from Yevgeny Prigozhin. Have we heard from President Putin?
Well, we have seen the video released by the Kremlin earlier today showing the Russian president and his address about the modernization of Russian industries. That was not related to the ongoing situation with the Wagner mercenary group. However, we understand that the Russian president also had a series of phone conversations with his international counterparts. He has talked to the Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi as well as to the Qatar Emir. And in all those conversations, the Russian president has been vouching their support and the certainty that Russian forces will be able to take the situation under control, as they have successfully done. We've also heard Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov saying that Moscow sees the Western countries as attempting to take advantage of the ongoing situation, and also stressing that the Russian intelligence is checking whether the Western intelligence was one way or another involved into the events of June 24. So in Russia, the understanding is very clear that Yevgeny Prigozhin has been trying to incite mutiny, but Yevgeny Prigozhin has cited his reasons in the 11-minute long audio address released on his Telegram channel. Let's listen in.
As a result of intrigues and thoughtless decisions, Wagner was supposed to cease to exist on July the 1st, 2023. We relayed this information to the fighters. Nobody agreed to sign the contracts offered by the MOD because everyone knows and judges by their experience that such action will lead to a complete loss of value.
So the idea, according to Yevgeny Prigozhin, was not to overthrow the authorities in Russia. The idea, he said, was to demonstrate their protest against the decision of the Russian authorities to make every volunteer detachment sign contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense that comes into force as of the 1st of July. See, Prigozhin has been saying that that was the march of justice and that his fighters were efficient. He was also saying that the Wagner fighters have managed to make the way up to the Russian capital. That was a master class, as he has described it, of what the Russian army should have done back on the 24th of February 2022. So essentially he has continued his criticism, but certainly many experts are now suggesting that this whole story with Yevgeny Prigozhin is far from being over. However, we understand that Prigozhin is now in Belarus, as the deal that has been brokered by the Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko has suggested. There's been no confirmation from Prigozhin himself about his whereabouts, but again, we are expecting also the criminal charges against Prigozhin to be dropped as part of that deal.
So emergency counter-terrorism measures put in over the weekend have now been rolled back. What's the mood like now in Russia?
Well, life in Russia is getting back to normal, and aside from some of the troubles with the roads that have resulted from the movement of the convoy along the highway from Rostov-on-Don towards the Russian capital, the rest is absolutely fine. We have seen some sort of rescheduling when it comes to public events. They are now extended to, they have been put off till later dates, but the counterterrorism operations regime has been lifted in Moscow, the Russian capital, as well as in Moscow region, in Voronezh region, and people will just continue to live as usual. But Monday was a non-working day for many Muscovites, as the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, has ordered.
Dasha, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Sudan's Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group says it seized the main base of an armed police unit in the capital, Khartoum. Footage released by the RSF claims to show its soldiers inside the building removing boxes of ammunition. The group also claims to have taken tanks and armoured vehicles. Clashes between the RSF and Sudan's army have intensified since Saturday, when the latest ceasefire agreement ran out. At least 2.5 million people have been displaced in the humanitarian crisis caused by the violence, which has now entered its 11th week.
Police fired tear gas at Sierra Leone's main opposition party headquarters after a tense election that both the opposition and the sitting president claim to have won. Candidate Samura Kamara of the All People's Congress says live ammunition was also fired and a woman was seriously injured. Sierra Leone is trying to curb surging living costs and boost a struggling economy.
Montreal in Canada had the most polluted air quality in the world on Monday. That's according to Swiss group IQ Air's index. The city was covered in smog on Sunday because of smoke from wildfires which have been burning for weeks. Sports events were cancelled and the local government advised closing all outdoor sports facilities.
The European Union must significantly accelerate cuts to greenhouse gas emissions if it's to hit its own climate targets. That's the first ever report by the European Climate Neutrality Observatory, tracking a wide range of sectors to assess the bloc's progress. It says that while measures are going in the right direction, they are lagging far behind what's required, and that Brussels needs to increase green investments by around $400 billion per year. Well, Michael Mealing is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT, and he joins us now. Thank you very much indeed. It's good to see you again, Michael. So what do you make of this report, and would you agree with the major strengths and weaknesses identified in the EU's efforts?
Well, thanks for having me. Yes, I would agree. I've been a long-term observer of European climate policy. It is, of course, in many ways a leader compared to the efforts of many other countries around the world, including the United States, in terms of the ambition of climate policy. It's pioneered a lot of policies. But I also agree with some of the shortcomings, some of the areas where things are not progressing as fast as they should.
And the report also evaluates the functioning of the governance systems related to climate neutrality. What do you think the key observations and recommendations were?
Well, so the report paints a pretty positive picture. I think it rightly reflects the fact that the EU, as you probably know from reporting on European climate policy, has just gone through a tremendous process of adding new rules and expanding sort of the overall governance framework with the European Green Deal, with the Fit for 55 legislative and policy package. So there's no shortage of rules, regulations, guidance documents, etc., that really paint a pretty clear picture what Europe is looking to achieve, where it's headed, and also builds in certain monitoring and sort of review processes to ensure that Europe remains on track. For instance, an independent scientific advisory body to keep, if you like, the EU honest in its own assessment of progress. That said, you know, there's still a few shortfalls in individual member states, but overall, I think the EU does present a really interesting and compelling picture in terms of the governance of this broad, massive transition.
And what kind of challenges do they have on their plate? What are the most significant challenges that the EU faces in its journey to climate neutrality, and how are they effectively trying to address these?
So the report looks at a lot of different individual sectors and also some cross-cutting areas. And it does highlight, as you already mentioned, that in some areas the pace of change, of progress is too slow. In some areas, it's really far too slow. And in a few areas, it's even going in the wrong direction. Let me start maybe with those last ones. So in the broad sort of area of climate finance and investment, it observes that there's just not enough investment. And in some cases, funding is still going to the wrong purposes. For instance, additional fossil fuel infrastructure, generation assets, etc. Also with a specific technology, carbon capture and sequestration and carbon dioxide removals, there the EU is simply not engaging fast enough, aggressively enough. Other areas like transportation, the electricity sector, industry, things are moving in the right direction, but too slowly. So there's not enough investment, there's not enough effort and focus put in those sectors. So the report suggests a number of improvements that could be done or could be taken forward by the EU to accelerate progress. But of course, as we know, there's reasons why things are going slowly. Often it's just politically very difficult. Funds are scarce. So it won't be easy to fix sort of the observations that the report puts out.
But if they are going to speed up that pace, if they're going to sharpen that focus, how important would international cooperation beyond the EU's borders be in terms of collaborating with other countries, other nations, other organisations?
Well, the fact of the matter is, even if the EU managed to fix all those shortcomings and become get straight A's across the board in this periodic review, it's still only a small share of global emissions. And the global climate problem cannot be solved without getting other countries with vastly different circumstances and sort of socioeconomic realities to progress as well. If you're a country like India or a country in sub-Saharan Africa, priorities will be dramatically different, as will capacities and resources available for the energy transition. And so one of the most important things that you can do is work in tandem with other countries around the world to assist them, to help them accelerate and leapfrog, if you like, some of the development stages that the EU went through to go from heavy industry and pollution to straight to clean industries, clean transportation, etc., clean electricity. But that takes investment that those countries often don't have. So things like just energy transition partnerships with a growing number of countries is a way to try and engage those countries that don't have the resources, don't have the means to leapfrog the way the EU is right now. And I think we'll need more of that going forward. As we've seen in the climate negotiations, the gap between the more wealthy, the more advanced countries and the poorer countries in the world is only expanding. So this is really a major challenge.
Michael Mealing, great to get your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. This old dog has learned some new tricks. Rambo's new life after his rescue from Ukraine's front line.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew. And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. China has signed a long-term liquefied natural gas purchase deal with Qatar.
The deal allows China to boost its energy security and secures a reliable income source for Qatar. Our correspondent Jim Stemman reports.
A deal between two regions forming ever closer ties.
It's very significant. You know, China it's the world's biggest LNG importer, maybe second to Japan sometimes, but it will clearly overtake Japan in the next few years. It's the growth market.
And that growth market is one that Qatar, among the world's largest LNG exporters, is keen to tap into, signaling its second major gas supply deal with a Chinese state-owned company in less than a year. This one, a 27-year agreement with China National Petroleum Corporation for 4 million metric tons of liquefied natural gas per year.
The second portion really was the award of a 1.25% equity portion in phase one of the Qatar North Field East LNG expansion. That expansion will add a total of 32 million tons per year from 2026. So CNPC now, alongside Sinopec and some of the big Western majors, including Total, now own an equity portion in that project.
And for Qatar, this latest deal allows the Gulf nation to lock in demand for nearly 3 decades, at a time when much of the world is trying to move away from fossil fuels.
For China, this is really strategic too, because they have now 2 state companies involved in the first phase of the LNG expansion in Qatar.
The Chinese economy will presumably continue growing and developing over this time. Its use of gas today is a very small share of total Chinese energy. I mean, it's still colossal, but as a share of the total, it's small. So there's a lot more room for gas to expand its use in China.
And while there's likely to be more LNG deals between China and the Gulf going forward, Beijing will benefit financially from its ability to sign much longer agreements than European countries that have struggled to replace Russian gas in the wake of the conflict in Ukraine.
Europe needs LNG now, but it doesn't think it will need it increasingly in the 2030s and 2040s. I think that's probably mistaken. I think Europe will probably find that it does need gas, but anyway, that's the position that they've taken.
For now, though, the LNG deal between Qatar and China is yet another example of the Gulf region's pivot east, with China expected to make up a large chunk of its oil and gas exports in the decades ahead. Jim Stenman, CGTN, Dubai.
While staying in the Middle East, millions of worshippers are jumping on what's known as the Mecca Metro as they undertake the annual Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. And the trains taking them there are made in China. Our correspondent, Zheng Saran, reports.
Operating 24/7, transporting over 100,000 passengers per hour at peak times. During the annual Hajj pilgrimage, Mecca Metro in Saudi Arabia becomes the world's busiest line. Since 2010, this line has used trains made by the China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation Changchun, one of China's largest train manufacturers.
We customize A-type aluminum alloy wide-body metro trains for the Mecca line. Each train is composed of 12 carriages and has a capacity of around 5,000 passengers. Our trains also meet the requirements of safe operation at a temperature of 50 degrees Celsius or under strong wind of over 40 miles per hour.
CRRC's trains were also in use during the 2016 Olympic Games in Brazil. As cooperation between China and Brazil grows, there have been achievements in the development of train technology too.
The tailored trains for Brazil were equipped with an overspeed protection device, which would issue an automatic alert and slow down the train once it reaches the speed limit. After a decade of research and development, our unmanned metro trains can initiate operations like auto wake-up, auto departure, precise parking, and auto detection.
By the end of 2022, over 9,000 trains have been exported from here to over 20 countries and regions around the globe. CRRC Changchun had signed more than $30 billion worth of contracts with international clients. Today, Chinese infrastructure is expanding to overseas markets.
In May 2022, we established the very first overseas high-level maintenance base in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, to better serve the customers' needs of building local industrial chains. We are hoping to generate more operations hubs to achieve production, procurement, employment, services, and the management overseas.
All of this was made possible by the Belt and Road Initiative, which is seeing a growing presence for Chinese rail products around the world. Zhang Siren, CGTN, Changchun City.
2 more Chinese developers have failed to meet dollar bond payments. Both companies, Central China Real Estate and Leading Holdings Group, cited deteriorating sales and weakness in the country's property market. They also said they will engage with external advisors for solutions. It comes after several similar cases in the country last week.
Officials attending the so-called Summer Davos Economic Forum are arriving in the host city of Tianjin in northern China. This year's forum will start on Tuesday, focusing on how entrepreneurship could boost the world economy. About 1,500 leaders from more than 90 countries are attending, including a top delegation from Saudi Arabia and the Prime Ministers of Mongolia, Barbados, Vietnam and New Zealand.
Chinese golfer Yin Ruoning has won the KPMG Women's PGA Championship in the United States, claiming her first major title. The 20-year-old beat Japanese golfer Yuka Saso on the final hole with a 10-foot birdie putt. The victory makes her the second Chinese woman to win a golf major after Feng Shanxia.
Well, from Ukraine's front line to the streets of Budapest, a military dog who nearly died after a rocket attack in Kharkiv has been sniffing out his new post at the Hungarian capital's police academy. Our correspondent Pablo Gutierrez reports.
4 weeks into his training with the Budapest Police K9 unit, and Rambo is already becoming the top dog of the squad. This 3-year-old German Shepherd is a true fighter, according to his handler, who has worked with him since his arrival.
When he arrived at the training centre after we adopted him, Rambo would just lie on the ground. He was also afraid of going down the stairs. We worked hard with him. He has lost those fears and, as you can see, he's ready to show his new skills.
It was nearly a year ago in Kharkiv that Rambo almost lost his life while on patrol with Ukraine's military. Shrapnel from a rocket attack blew pieces of his skull away, damaged his ear and shattered his jaw. He needed emergency surgery to save his life.
Rambo was in a lot of pain after the surgery. He had the surgery in Kharkiv, and doctors had to rebuild his jaw and extract teeth. They cared for him physically, but they also helped to restore his soul.
Violeta Kovacs heads the German Shepherd Rescue Group in Hungary. Since the start of the conflict, she has rescued 10 dogs from Ukraine's front lines. When she met Rambo, she immediately grew fond of him and brought him to a rehabilitation center in Budapest. It was there she discovered how good Rambo was with children, and it became clear to her what his new mission should be.
Rambo's combat days are behind him, and now this courageous pup, as a new cadet with the Budapest Police Department, is on a new mission, and that is to teach people to be tolerant to those with disabilities. Right, Pop? Come on, such a good boy you are. Yes, you are. Go, 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 Rambo.
One of Rambo's duties will be to interact with children and disabled adults at police events and rehabilitation centers in Hungary.
We never imagined the attention he would get around the world. I think his story speaks to people about overcoming obstacles. Having him here gives us the opportunity to spread this message to more people.
His story of survival, perseverance, and kindness has now made him world famous. Pablo Gutierrez, CGTN, Budapest.
And finally, a moment of bonding in the waters of Sydney's Bondi Beach. This curious humpback whale decided to keep a kayaker company by swimming alongside him. The moment was caught on camera by a drone flying overhead. A swimmer could also be seen nearby in the shallow waters. Humpback whales usually migrate from the Antarctic Ocean towards Australia's east coast between June and August.
And the headlines again. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin is heard for the first time since halting the rebellion, which he says started because of injustice, and claims his troops did not march to overthrow Russia's leadership.
That rebellion hits the ruble as the turmoil in Russia sends its currency plunging to a 15-month low.
And New Zealand and China talk trade and tourism during the Prime Minister's first trip to Beijing.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live, but we'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.